tell me something that white people aren't ready to hear.
There are no white people. Race is not a real thing, at least not biologically. Look, this is Europe. It's where they make the white people. It's also, incidentally, where they made the modern idea of race in the first place.
White people are not Caucasian. Let's talk about it.
On Earth, the people should be predominantly black or various shades of brown skin. And that makes perfect sense, because if you look at Homo erectus, the beings that were on Earth at the time the Anunnaki first arrived here, the species that were used to create us, they were a dark-skinned global species. They existed basically everywhere on the planet, and they were all dark-skinned. There were no white-skinned Homo erectus, even in the coldest regions of Earth at that time. So white skin is not native to our planet.
White people, where do you come from? You know, my ancestors say something which I don't know if I'm refusing to believe or it's a shock or whatever. Please, those of you white people who do mediums, who speak to your ancestors, could you ask your ancestors where you come from?
When we say white people, well, technically there aren't any white people. Everyone's color is between ivory beige to brown. But speaking about Germanic people, Swedes, Danes, Germans, Dutch, English, etc., all evidence, be it Indo-European migrational patterns or Aryan migrational patterns or Noah's Ark in Mount Ararat or origins of blue eye color or stories of ancient Scythians and Khazars or early Islamic or biblical maps pointing to the land of Magog. Every lead points to one and the same area, the Northern Caucasus.
Yaqub. Have you ever heard of the story of Yaqub, the mad scientist who, according to the Nation of Islam, actually created white people? Yeah, I know, sounds like something straight out of a comic book or a sci-fi movie, but for real, this is a central belief in the Nation of Islam theology. So here's the breakdown. Yaqub, sometimes known as the big hit scientist, was supposedly born around 6,600 years ago on the island of Patmos. That's right, the same island from the Bible's book of Revelation. And this guy wasn't your average kid. Legend has it that Yaqub had a gigantic head and an even bigger brain, bursting with genius-level intelligence. He was so brilliant, they say that by age 18, he'd already mastered every branch of science. But Yaqub had a bit of a dark streak. He wasn't content with just being a prodigy. Nope. Yaqub had ambitions that were pretty hardcore. He wanted to create a new rebellious race of people. Why? Well, he reportedly saw himself as a rival to God, determined to build a people who would rule through cunning, manipulation, and deception, basically the ultimate villains. So Yaqub gathered thousands of his followers to set sail and landed on an island where he could begin his twisted genetic experiments. Through careful selective breeding, think ancient genetic engineering meets mad scientist type vibes, he started
biologically. Look, this is Europe. It's where they make the white people. It's also, incidentally, where they made the modern idea of race in the first place. Essentially, what happened was the European nobles, very heavy emphasis on the ironic use of the word noble there. So the European noble families that were actually kind of just one big inbred family, hence the noble aesthetic, after centuries and centuries of wastefully hurling their peasant folk at each other in vile bloodshed amounting to little more than just aristocratic bragging rights and moving lines on a map back and forth millimeters at a time, decided it would probably be more profitable for them if they instead started wastefully hurling their peasant folk at the rest of the world. And thus began the age of imperial colonialism. But in order to justify their actions through the lens of their so-called Christian morality, and in order to give their people a false sense of superiority over the people they were oppressing, they came up with the cultural lie that the people they were oppressing were technically not really people. I mean, obviously they can't be the same race of people we are. They don't even have basic civilized things like silly curly wigs or silly curly shoes or syphilis or a deep sense of profound Christian shame if someone were to glance at your nipples. See, when you're a tyrannical oppressor, it's very important to make sure the people you rule over are divided into groups by caste or by by class, or by race, and then making sure that those groups identify primarily through their differences so they remain divided, and you create a sort of self-segregating population. See, that way they're less likely to realize that even with their differences, they still have a lot more in common with each other than any of them do with the man in the castle at the top of the hill, and they probably stand to gain more from working together against you than continuing to participate in your silly charade. Broadly speaking, skin color and other racial traits are environmental. So the further from the equator your ancestors migrated, the paler your skin will be, because you needed paler skin to get more vitamin D from the sunlight. The thing is, just like how the environment changes gradually as you progress from south to north, so do the features. The change is gradual. Drawing an arbitrary line and saying this is where black ends and brown begins, and here's where brown ends and white begins, makes no sense. Now, the modern consequences of race are very real and shouldn't be ignored, but when we talk about them, it do us well to remember that this was always a concept created to divide people in order to establish power over them in the first place.
Because plants were born to be green, humans were born to be black. That's science. That's not personal. You see, although a lot of folk, you may not like what I'm about to say, but this happens in nature all the time. We've seen it happen with gorillas. We've seen it happen with peacocks. We've seen it happen with roaches. We've seen it happen with plants. And that is that when you lose that nutrient, the ability to process melanin, you become albinoid. You become deficient in that nutrient. The process of producing that molecule we call melanin. When you become deficient in that, nature demands that you make up for it somehow. And the way it helped the Africans survive in that ice age for thousands of years was to depigment the skin. But in so doing, they also took away a lot of the melanin content within, known as eumelanin, which became in them what we call pheomelanin. And so they come back down across, but they only mate with themselves. So what's happening now is that a mutant is commingling with a mutant, which is taking the product further and further away from the archetype of humanity. I'm not speaking in terms of superior and inferior. That's not the science of this. That's the emotion. The science of it basically drops the dominant gene and the recessive gene. And everything that black folk have is dominant. Complexion of skin, pigmentation of skin, pigmentation of eyes, curly hair. The body is melanated. It has a certain morphology or structure. That is how the Creator said, this is what I want the human family to look like, and that's how they'll survive on this earth. But no one took into account Africans going into an area that is going to be hit with an ice age.
White people are not Caucasian. Let's talk about it. So for like a long time, I've always heard that white people came from the Caucasus Mountains. So I looked up the Caucasus Mountains because I wanted to know where it was, what was going on over there. You know, I was doing my research. So upon research, I figured out very quickly that Caucasian people and white people are two very different ethnicities. So the places that are in the Caucasus region or the Caucasus Mountains is Armenia, Azerbaijan. I'm not sure if I'm saying that correctly, but that is considered northwestern Iran, Georgia, because Georgia is a country, and Russia. So those are the 4 countries that are in the Caucasus regions and the Caucasus Mountains. And a few of the ethnic groups that lived there were the Turkish, the Greeks, the Romas, which is the Gypsies, and the Kurds. And then they have a group over there called the Turkic Caucasians. And I don't want to hear nobody saying that I'm making nothing up, so I'm about to read this. This is what it says. The term Caucasian is often used to refer to people of the European origin. Okay? That is what it says. And the European origin means that people originating from Europe, the Middle East, or North Africa. Keyword originated from. So if you were born here in the United States, you're just white. Many people in the US do not have ancestral ties to the Caucasus region. So yeah, stop believing everything that everybody tells you, because it's not always true. You have to look stuff up and do research on your own.
So where do white people come from? Let's talk about it. The God of the Bible calls himself the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Abraham had Isaac, and then Isaac had Jacob. But when Isaac had Jacob, he was born with a twin brother. The woman's name was Rebekah. And the Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. So God is saying 2 separate races are about to be born out of the same woman. And when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red, all over like a hairy garment, and they called his name Esau. And after that came out his brother, and his hand took hold on Esau's heel, and his name was called Jacob. Jacob's descendants would make up the nation of Israel. These 12 tribes of people. Pause for a better look. But basically, black people fall into the category of Israelites. Esau's descendants will make up the nation of Edom, or Edomites. This is where white people come from. But technically, Edomites are our brother nation, since we both came out of the same womb. Like, even when the 12 tribes lived together back east hundreds of years ago, look who's down here at the bottom. Edomites. Living right next to us. But what was down here was mountains and caves. That's where the idea of cavemen come from. Right here, God speaks to Obadiah in a vision about Edom, and here he says, thou that dwellest in the clefts of the rock, whose habitation is high. He's talking about how Edom lived high in the mountains, and how they lived in the clefts of the rock, which were the caves of the mountains. But if you look up Mount Edom, it will show you where they're from. Like, this has been there for hundreds of years. The Lord literally gave them natural protection from the sun, because we all know that white people are the main ones negatively affected by too much sunlight. But doesn't all this look a little familiar? Like, maybe I'm tripping, but it looks like they're paying homage to where they originally come from. And eventually they migrated from here, where Mount Edom is, up to the Caucasus mountain range. Here's a closer image, but this is literally why they're called Caucasian people today, because they lived in the Caucasus mountain range. But their true race or nation is Edom, same way our true race and nation is Israel. Not black or white or the name of a mountain range.
White people didn't even exist when the Neanderthals existed, but this comment does give me a great chance to info dump about some of the topics I'm really interested in, which are ancient humans, especially other species. At the end of 2024, researchers sequenced the oldest modern human genome. Now, it's not the oldest human genome ever sequenced, but it's the oldest of our species. It's just over 40,000 years old. That is just around the time frame where our species was interbreeding with the Neanderthals for the last time. This human had some of that admixture, and this is actually a representation of what they think this human would have looked like based on the DNA. Us and the Neanderthals are part of a close group of cousins. The third that I haven't talked about is the Denisovans. Denisovans were evolving from a common ancestor they had with the early Neanderthals. The Denisovans were out there in East Asia. Neanderthals were up in Europe in that area, and our species, our ancestors long ago, they were in Africa. So once they left Africa, some interbreeding happened. A weird thing, though, is that you would expect East Asian populations, I messed that up, but East Asian populations, you would expect them to have less Neanderthal DNA than the populations over here that are currently living where the Neanderthals roamed, but that's not what the genetic evidence suggested. Instead, time and time again, East Asian genomes had more Neanderthal DNA. A paper trying to figure out why that is found that it seems likely based on some of this genetic evidence, which again, ancient DNA is telling us so many things. But when you look up at Europe around 12,000 years ago, the hunter-gatherers within those populations, they have higher levels of Neanderthal admixture. But lots of those populations were replaced by later waves of farmers. And those farmers, they had less of that admixture. So more recently, that was watered down, leading East Asia to have more than West Asia. If you've seen a lot of my stuff on here, you may have heard me talk about the Arabian standstill before. It's a time period where it's like part of the out of Africa journey. However, it seems like our species stayed here for around 30,000 years or so before really expanding out. And that paper mentioned that it seems possible that some of these populations that had been hanging out here and had never left, had never made it out to interbreed with those Neanderthals, that may be where those later farmer populations were coming from, and it's why they brought that overall Neanderthal admixture down. Now let's wrap this up with the evolution of white skin. It's what I kind of started out talking about. I mentioned how it didn't exist when Neanderthals existed. Here's some of that more recent research. Researchers found that around 8,000 years ago, white skin was not super common in Europe. However, it was more common in the hunter-gatherer populations further north. And then over thousands of years, eventually some of those populations lead to farmer groups that are moving into Europe, and they're bringing those variants for that pale skin, that true white skin. Because remember, like, skin tone, it's a gradient. There is no like singular moment where there is suddenly white skin. However, what we are talking about when we are talking about white people, that super pale pigment, there are some specific mutations that are associated with that, and we can see when those things start to spike. And that's what they did here. So they found that that white skin was a very, especially in the human time frame thing, a very recent adaptation for some populations. Remember, I shouldn't have to say it, but no one human population is more evolved than any other. Skin pigmentation, it's not that big of a deal. It's just that as populations have moved around over time, they have adapted to a variety of things. It's not just one thing. It's not just vitamin D. It's not just the sun and UV. There are lots of different things. If you want to read about that complexity, I would highly recommend this source.
This video is intended to educate and inform. It draws on science, history, and cultural narratives to explore human origins. It is not intended to promote division, but understanding. Have you ever paused to ask yourself, where did white people actually come from? Not the myths, not the assumptions, but the real science-backed story. Why do some humans have light skin while others have dark? What happened along the way that made us look so different? The answer may surprise you, because this story isn't just about skin. It's about survival, migration, adaptation, and the ideas that shape the world we live in. In this video, we're unpacking one of the most misunderstood topics in human history. We'll look at the biblical narrative in Genesis 9:18-29, focusing on Noah's sons after the Great Flood. The migration of Japheth into the cold, the invention of racial categories, mutation and transformation, how skin tone adapted to new environments, when light skin symbolized affliction in ancient texts, and ultimately, the African origin of all humanity. This isn't just a biology lesson, it's a window into humanity's shared roots. Let's journey to the origin of what it means to be white. And trust me, you'll never look at race the same way again. The world had ended. The floodwaters consumed every hill, every home, every heart. Only Noah, his family, and the animals of the ark survived the judgment. As the waters retreated, humanity began again on the highlands of Mount Ararat, what is today Armenia. Here, the story of people began anew, not with one group, but with three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Each would become the ancestor of many nations. From Shem came the Semitic peoples, black-skinned tribes of Arabia, Assyria, and Elam. From Ham came the great African civilizations, Cushites, Egyptians, Canaanites, and early Dravidian peoples. Ham's descendants pioneered pyramids, developed writing, and charted the stars long before Europe saw its first wheel. Japheth, the youngest, migrated northward into colder, less forgiving lands beyond the Caucasus Mountains. At this stage, there were no white people. There were only humans, brown, black, and bronze. Skin tone held no social meaning. Names like Moors, Cushites, and Phoenicians referred to culture and geography, not color. But as time passed, dispersion gave rise to distinction. Japheth's descendants entered unfamiliar colder regions, through the Caucasus, into the forests of Europe and the steppes of the north. These were the Japhites, Thracians, Gauls, Scythians, and early Greeks. They would become the ancestors of the Celts, Saxons. Modern genetics confirms skin color is an adaptation. Mutations in genes like SLC24A5 and MC1R affected melanin production. This wasn't evolution towards something better. It was a survival response to different geography. We see traces of this in blonde aboriginals of Australia and in albino Africans with pale Europe struggled for survival. History has always been more colorful than we were told. Even today, most of the world is black and brown. But the myth of white dominance lingers, not because it's true, but because it's been repeated. Yet now, we reclaim the story. This is not a tale of blame. It's a story of beginning, of how identity